Hey everyone, I'm so glad you could join me around the fire tonight. We have a dark one planned for you. If you love these kinds of stories and want to make sure you never miss a nightmare, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give the story a like. It really helps the channel keep the lights on or off if that's how you prefer it. The silence in the Appalachian Mountains isn't really silence. It's a weight. It's a heavy, physical thing that presses against your eardrums until you start hearing things that aren't there. Or, more accurately, you start hearing things that have been there for a very long time, hiding in the frequencies of the wind and the creak of the old-growth pines. I was walking the high trail toward Wolter Ridge. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm a wanderer by nature and a collector of songs by trade. Over my shoulder, I carried a guitar case that had seen better decades. Inside was a piece of wood and wire that was more than just an instrument. It had strings of pure, hammered silver. In these parts, silver isn't just for jewelry. It's for protection. The sun was starting to dip behind the jagged spine of the ridge, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. The air turned cold fast, the kind of cold that feels like a damp hand touching the back of your neck. I wasn't here for the view. I was here because of the letters. A woman named Sarah had written to me, claiming that something heavy and wrong had settled over her family's land. She said the birds had stopped singing. She said the shadows were moving when the sun was still high in the sky. As I rounded a bend in the trail, the trees seemed to lean in closer. These weren't the friendly oaks you see in a park. These were ancient, twisted things with bark that looked like scarred skin. Their branches clawed at the gray sky. I stopped for a moment to adjust my pack, and that's when I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was slower, more rhythmic. It sounded like something very large was breathing deep inside the earth beneath my boots. I looked down at the dirt. The ground was dry, but there was a strange, oily vibration running through it. I felt it in my teeth. "You shouldn't be up here, stranger." The voice was thin and dry, like dead leaves blowing across a tombstone. I turned slowly. Standing near a cluster of laurel bushes was a man. He was tall, thin as a rail, and dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in a museum from the 1920s. His skin was the color of old parchment, and his eyes were the worst part. They were pale, almost white, like cataracts had taken them over, but I could tell he saw me perfectly. "I'm Elias," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm looking for the Sarah Barton place." The man didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. "The Bartons are gone, Elias Thorne. They didn't belong to the ridge. The ridge belongs to the old ones. They were here before the trees. They were here before the dirt." He took a step forward, and I noticed something that made my skin crawl. He wasn't wearing shoes. His feet were bare, and the skin on them was dark and cracked, almost looking like hooves. He didn't seem to notice the sharp rocks or the cold. "I heard there was trouble," I said, reaching back to touch the handle of my guitar case. Just the contact with the silver strings inside seemed to hum a little, a low vibration that gave me a spark of courage. "I heard something was waking up." The man laughed. It was a wet, rattling sound. "Waking? No, they've been awake. They've just been hungry. And now the table is set." He pointed a long, skeletal finger toward the peak of Wolter Ridge. Up there, perched like a vulture on a branch, was a massive stone formation. From this distance, it looked like a pair of giant, sightless eyes staring down at the world. The locals called it the Twin Cairns. Legend said they were markers for a gate that should never be opened. "Who are you?" I asked. "I'm just a whisper in the wind," he muttered. "But if I were you, boy, I'd turn around. The silver on your back won't save you if you step onto the hallowed ground. The Vane brothers are already up there. They've brought the blood. They've brought the calling." Before I could ask who the Vane brothers were, the man simply faded. He didn't run. He didn't walk away. He just seemed to dissolve into the deepening shadows of the laurel bushes. One second he was there, and the next there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the thorns. I stood there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct I had told me to run, to get back to my car, drive down the mountain, and never look back. But I thought about Sarah's letter. She had sounded so terrified, and I knew that if the things people whispered about Wolter Ridge were true, running wouldn't matter. If the old gods woke up, there wouldn't be anywhere left to run to. I kept walking. The trail got steeper and narrower. The smell of the forest changed. It no longer smelled like pine and earth. It started to smell like copper, like old blood. It was faint at first, but as I got closer to the Barton property, it became overwhelming. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse in the middle of a July heat wave. I reached a small clearing where a cabin stood. It was Sarah's place, or it used to be. The windows were smashed out, and the front door was hanging off one hinge, swaying back and forth in the wind. Creak, slam, creak, slam. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under my weight. I pulled my guitar from its case. I didn't need to play a song yet, but I needed to feel the silver. I held the neck of the instrument tight. "Sarah?" I called out. No answer. Only the rhythmic creak slam of the door. I stepped inside. The interior was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. They weren't painted on. They were scratched into the wood, deep and jagged, as if someone had used their fingernails until they bled. The symbols looked like coiled snakes, or maybe like intestines. They all pointed toward the center of the room. In the middle of the floor there was a hole. It wasn't a hole made by a tool. It looked like the floorboards had simply rotted away in a perfect circle, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath the house. I walked to the edge and looked down. It was deep, too deep. I couldn't see the bottom, but I could hear something. Slurp, slurp, slurp. It was the sound of something wet moving in the dark. It sounded like a tongue licking a wound. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees. My breath came out in a white cloud. I felt a presence behind me. Not the old man from the trail, but something much larger. Something that felt like an ocean of cold grease. I didn't turn around. I knew if I turned around, I would see something that would break my mind. Instead, I reached down and plucked the low E string of my guitar. Twang. The silver string vibrated, sending a clear, sharp note through the cabin. The sound was like a physical shockwave. The wet slurping sound stopped instantly. The heavy presence behind me seemed to recoil, drawing back into the shadows. But then, a voice came from the hole in the floor. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, layered on top of each other. "Play all you want, singer," the voices hissed. "The strings will snap, the silver will tarnish, and then we will eat the music right out of your throat." I backed away from the hole, my hands shaking. I scrambled out of the cabin and back into the night. But the night wasn't empty anymore. All around the clearing, in the treeline, I could see them. Eyes, hundreds of pale, unblinking eyes, reflecting the dying light of the moon. They were waiting. The old gods weren't just waking up. They were already here. And they were very, very hungry. I gripped my guitar and looked up at the twin cairns on the mountain peak. The real horror was only just beginning. The eyes didn't blink. That was the first thing I noticed as I backed away from the rotting porch of the Barton cabin. A normal animal, a deer, a coyote, even a predatory cat, has a rhythm to its gaze. There's a flicker of a lid, a shift in focus. But these things in the treeline were static. They were like holes punched into the fabric of the night, letting a cold, pale light leak through from somewhere else. I didn't turn my back on them. I kept my guitar clutched to my chest, my fingers hovering over the silver strings. The weight of the instrument was the only thing keeping me grounded. Silver is a funny thing. People think it's just for werewolves or vampires because of the movies, but in the deep hollows of the Appalachians we know better. Silver is a pure conductor. It's a repellent for things that shouldn't be composed of matter at all. It's a wall between the world of the living and the things that crawled out of the earth before the first star was ever named. I reached the edge of the clearing where the trail vanished into a thicket of mountain laurel. The laurel here grew tall and skeletal, their branches intertwining like the fingers of 1,000 drowning men. As I stepped into the shadow of the canopy, the temperature plummeted again. My skin prickled, and the hair on my arms stood straight up. Crunch. The sound of a dry branch breaking came from my left. I swung my head around. 10 feet away, a shape detached itself from the trunk of a massive hemlock tree. It wasn't the old man from before. This was something else. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and impossibly thin. Its limbs were too long, the joints knobby and distorted. It didn't have clothes, but its skin was the color of wet slate, clinging tight to a frame of jagged bone. It didn't have a face. Not really. Where the nose and mouth should have been, there was only a vertical slit that pulsed with a dull, rhythmic throb. Above that slit, 2 of those unblinking, pale eyes stared into my soul. It made a sound. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a vibration, a low-frequency hum that rattled the fillings in my teeth and made my vision blur. "Not today," I whispered, my voice cracking. I swept my thumb across the silver strings. A sharp, bright chord rang out, a G major that felt like a bolt of lightning in the stagnant air of the woods. The creature shrieked. It wasn't a vocal sound. It was the sound of metal grinding on metal. It recoiled, its long, spindly arms flailing as if the music had physically burned it. It vanished back into the laurel thicket with a speed that no living thing should possess. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned and ran. The trail upward was a nightmare of switchbacks and loose shale. Every time I thought I had found my footing, the ground seemed to shift beneath me, as if the mountain itself were trying to shake me off its back. The smell of copper and rot grew stronger with every foot of elevation I gained. It was thick enough to taste, a metallic, salty tang that coated my tongue. After what felt like hours of climbing, I reached a plateau. This was the Dead Man's Shelf, a flat expanse of rock that sat just below the summit of Wolter Ridge. In the center of the shelf stood a small stone hut. It was ancient, built of dry-stacked fieldstone without a lick of mortar. No smoke came from the chimney, but there was a light flickering in the window, a sickly, greenish glow that didn't look like fire. I approached the hut cautiously. I knew who lived here, or rather, I knew who was supposed to live here. The Vane brothers, Caleb and Silas Vane. They were sin-eaters by reputation, but the rumors in the valley said they had stopped eating sins and started committing them in the name of the things that slept under the ridge. I reached the door. It was made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands. Before I could even knock, the door groaned open. The interior of the hut was cramped and smelled of burnt hair and sulfur. Sitting at a rough-hewn table were 2 men. They looked like twins, though one was scarred across the face as if a giant claw had tried to peel his skin away. They were dressed in heavy wool and buckskin, and on the table between them lay a map. But it wasn't a map of the mountains. It was a map of stars, stars that didn't belong to our sky. "The singer arrives," the scarred one said. His voice was deep, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a well. "That would be Silas. He brought the silver," the other one, Caleb, added. He didn't look at me. He was staring at a bowl of dark liquid in the center of the table. "He thinks the silver will protect the song. But the song is already fading. Isn't it, Elias?" I stepped into the room, keeping the door open behind me. "Where is Sarah Barton? And what are you doing to this mountain?" Silas laughed, a dry, hacking sound. He stood up, and I realized how big he was. He towered over me, his shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the green-flamed candles. "Sarah is a guest. She's part of the invitation. You can't wake the old ones with just prayers, boy. You need a lineage. You need blood that's been tied to this dirt for 200 years. She didn't want this," I said, my hand tightening on the guitar. "What she wants doesn't matter," Caleb said, finally looking up. His eyes were different from the things in the woods, but not by much. They were bloodshot and frantic. The world is gray, Elias. It's rotting. People are weak. But the old ones, they are power. They are the hunger that never ends. When they rise, the ridge will be the center of a new world. A red world. He stood up and walked toward a corner of the hut. He pulled back a heavy wool curtain, revealing a woman tied to a wooden chair. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with a terror so deep it looked like madness. Her mouth was gagged with a strip of black cloth, but she was making a low, desperate whimpering sound. But it wasn't just the fact that she was tied up. It was what was happening to her. Thin, translucent threads, like spider silk, but pulsing with that same green light, were growing out of the stone wall behind her and disappearing into her skin. They were hooked into her neck, her wrists, and her temples. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was being used as a battery. "Let her go," I said. My voice was low, dangerous. Silas stepped between me and Sarah. He pulled a long, curved knife from his belt. The blade wasn't steel. It looked like it was carved from a giant, yellowed tooth. "You don't understand the music you're trying to play, singer," Silas said. "This isn't a folk song. This is an anthem, and you're just a sour note." He lunged. I didn't have time to think. I swung the guitar case like a club. The heavy wood caught Silas in the side of the head, sending him staggering back. But he didn't fall. He shook his head, a predatory grin spreading across his face. I reached into the case and ripped the guitar out. I didn't play a chord this time. I grabbed the silver strings and pulled them tight, using the instrument as a shield. Caleb began to chant. It wasn't a language I recognized. It sounded like the wet, slurping noise I'd heard in the hole back at the cabin, but amplified. The green candles flared, the flames reaching the ceiling. The stone walls of the hut began to bleed. Not red blood, but a thick, black ichor that smelled like an open grave. The twin cairns. Caleb shouted over the roaring of the wind that had suddenly picked up outside. "The gate is unlatched. Can you hear them, Elias? Can you hear the grandfathers screaming for their meat?" Outside, the mountain let out a roar. It wasn't the wind. It was a physical sound of stone grinding against stone. The ground tilted. Sarah let out a muffled scream as the threads in her skin pulled tighter, glowing with an agonizing intensity. I looked at Silas, who was crouching, ready to spring again. I looked at Caleb, his face contorted in a religious ecstasy. And then I looked past them, through the open door. The twin cairns on the summit were glowing. Two pillars of white, dead light shot up into the sky, tearing through the clouds. And in that light, I saw shapes, massive, bloated shapes that defied geometry, descending from the stars toward the peak of Wolter Ridge. I realized then that I wasn't just here to save Sarah. I was here to keep the world from being swallowed whole. I slammed my hand down on the strings, playing the most dissonant, jarring chord I could muster. The silver shrieked. The vibration was so intense it cracked the stone floor of the hut. "Get back!" I yelled at Silas, but Silas didn't get back. He looked at the knife in his hand, then at the glowing peak, and then he did something that chilled me to the bone. He plunged the tooth knife into his own forearm and began to draw a symbol in his own blood on the floor. "The blood is the key," he hissed, "and we have so much of it to give." The floor beneath the hut began to groan. The slurping sound was coming from everywhere now. The old gods weren't just coming from the sky. They were coming up through the rock. I had to get Sarah out. I had to get to the summit. But first, I had to survive the Vane brothers. The blood on the floor didn't just sit there. As Silas Vane dragged his wounded arm across the stone, the red liquid began to smoke. It sizzled against the cold rock like water on a hot griddle. The symbol he was drawing looked like a coiled, multi-limbed thing, a knot of snakes with too many heads. As the circle closed, The green light from the threads attached to Sarah began to pulse in sync with the blood. "The earth is thirsty, Elias," Silas screamed. He lunged again, the tooth knife whistling through the air. I ducked, feeling the wind of the blade pass inches from my throat. I didn't have a knife. I didn't have a gun. All I had was the guitar. I gripped the neck of the instrument and swung it upward, catching Silas right under the jaw. The sound was a sickening thud crack. He flew backward, crashing into the table and sending the star charts scattering into the black ichor pooling on the floor. But Caleb didn't stop chanting. He was on his knees now, his hands pressed into the dirt in the corner of the hut. His eyes were rolled back in his head, showing only the yellowed whites. "The gate is wide," Caleb whispered, his voice sounding like 1,000 dry insects rubbing their wings together. "The high pines are calling their own." I scrambled toward Sarah. She was shaking so hard the wooden chair was rattling against the floor. The green threads were vibrating now, making a high-pitched whine that felt like a needle being pushed into my brain. I reached out to touch one of the threads, and a spark of green static jumped to my finger. It burned like acid. "Sarah, look at me," I shouted. Her eyes drifted toward mine, but they were vacant. She was seeing something I couldn't. She was looking past me, past the walls of the hut, into a void that didn't have a bottom. I knew I couldn't just pull the threads out. They were rooted into her. I looked at my guitar. The silver strings. Silver was a purifier. It was the only thing that could cut through this filth. I took a deep breath and grabbed the silver E-string. I pulled it taut, stretching it away from the fretboard until it groaned. I used it like a saw, pressing the silver wire against the pulsing green thread at Sarah's wrist. The moment the silver touched the green light, there was a sound like a fuse blowing. A bright flash of white light filled the room, and the green thread snapped. It didn't just break. It shriveled up and turned into black ash. Sarah let out a jagged, gasping breath. "Again," I muttered to myself. I worked fast, sawing through the threads at her other wrist, her neck, and finally her temples. Each time the silver cut the light, the cabin shook. The mountain was angry. The slurping sound from below turned into a low, rhythmic thumping, like a giant fist hitting the underside of the earth. As the last thread snapped, Sarah slumped forward. I caught her before she hit the floor. She was cold, colder than the mountain air. "Elias?" she whispered. Her voice was a ghost of a sound. "I've got you. We have to move. Now." I hauled her to her feet. She was unsteady, her legs like jelly. Behind us, Silas was groaning, trying to push himself up from the wreckage of the table. His jaw was hanging at a wrong angle, but he was still reaching for that yellow tooth knife. "Go!" I shoved Sarah toward the door. We burst out of the hut and onto the dead man's shelf. The world had changed in the short time I'd been inside. The sky wasn't black anymore. It was a bruised, sickly purple. The clouds were swirling in a massive funnel cloud directly above the twin cairns on the summit. And the trees, the high pines, were moving. There was no wind, but the trees were swaying. They were leaning toward us, their long, needle-covered branches reaching out like fingers. "The trail," Sarah gasped, pointing toward the dark wall of trees. "We have to get to the lower trail." We ran. We didn't have a choice. Behind us, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. It was Caleb, but he wasn't chanting anymore. He was howling. It was a long, mournful sound that was answered by dozens of other voices from deep within the woods. We hit the treeline of the high pines. This part of the forest was legendary in the valley. People didn't come here to hunt or hike. They didn't even come here to log. The trees were too old, too dense, and the shadows were too deep. They called it the Missing Woods because of how many people had walked in and never walked out. As soon as we stepped under the canopy, the light from the twin cairns disappeared. It was pitch black. The only thing I could see were the pale, unblinking eyes of the things following us in the brush. Step, crunch, step, crunch. Every time we moved, they moved. They stayed just out of sight, pacing us. "Elias," Look, Sarah whispered, grabbing my arm. I looked where she was pointing. Between two massive, gnarled pines, a figure was standing. It wasn't one of the monsters. It was a man. He was wearing an old flannel shirt and denim overalls. He was standing perfectly still, his back to us. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding flat and muffled in the heavy air. "Can you help us?" The man didn't move. He didn't turn around. We walked closer, thinking maybe he was hurt or in shock. But as we got within 5 feet, I realized why he wasn't answering. He wasn't a man anymore. He was part of the tree. Pine needles were growing out of his ears and eyes. His skin had been replaced by rough, gray bark. His arms were stretched out, his fingers elongated into jagged branches that had merged with the hemlock next to him. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and inside his throat, I could see a bird's nest built of human hair. "Oh God!" Sarah choked out, covering her mouth. This was what happened to the missing. They didn't die. They were absorbed. The ridge didn't want their souls. It wanted their matter. It was building a forest out of the people it stole. Suddenly, the man shifted. His bark-covered head creaked as it turned toward us. There were no eyes in the sockets, only clusters of green pine needles that twitched like insect legs. "Help me!" The thing wheezed. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of wood rubbing against wood. From the shadows around us, more figures began to emerge. Dozens of them. Some were half-merged with the ground, their legs turned into roots. Others were hanging from the branches by their own intestines, which had become vines. They were all turning toward us, their wooden limbs creaking and snapping as they moved. "The silver Elias!" Sarah screamed. "Play something." I didn't play a song. I didn't have time for a melody. I gripped the guitar and ripped my hand across all 6 strings with everything I had. The silver chord exploded into the silence. The sound was like a physical wall of energy. The tree people shrieked, a sound of splintering wood and dying birds, and recoiled. The needles in their eyes shriveled. "Run!" I yelled. We sprinted through the high pines. The forest felt like it was shrinking, the trees closing in to trap us. I could feel the branches clawing at my jacket, tearing the fabric, drawing thin lines of blood on my face. The smell of copper was so strong now I felt like I was drowning in it. The ground began to slope upward. We were being pushed. The things in the woods weren't trying to catch us anymore. They were hurting us. They were driving us away from the valley and straight toward the summit. Straight toward the twin cairns. I looked up. The white pillars of light were blinding now. I could see the shapes in the sky more clearly. They looked like massive, bloated jellyfish made of stone and smoke. They were descending slowly, their long, translucent tentacles reaching down to touch the peaks of the mountains. "We can't go up there," Sarah cried, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "We don't have a choice," I said, looking back. Behind us, Silas and Caleb were coming. They weren't running. They were gliding, their feet barely touching the ground. They were surrounded by a pack of the slate-skinned, faceless creatures. Silas was holding the tooth knife high, the blade glowing with a sickly yellow light. We reached a clearing just below the final ascent. In the center of the clearing was an old stone well. It looked like it had been there since the beginning of time. The stones were covered in the same coiling snake symbols I'd seen in the cabin. As we ran past it, I heard a splash. But it wasn't the sound of a rock hitting water. It was the sound of something very heavy and very wet climbing out. A hand gripped the edge of the well. It was a human hand, but it was the size of a shovel. The skin was pale and bloated, as if it had been underwater for 100 years. "Don't look," I warned Sarah, but it was too late. A head rose from the well. It was a face I recognized from an old photograph in Sarah's cabin. It was her grandfather who had gone missing 20 years ago, but his face was stretched like taffy, his jaw hanging down to his chest, and his eyes were leaking that same black ichor that was on the floor of the hut. "Welcome home, Sarah," The thing in the well gurgled. The grandfathers are hungry, and the table is finally set. I felt the ground lurch. The entire mountain was shifting, turning. The path back to the valley was gone. There was only the path up. The high pines had closed the doors behind us. We were trapped on the ridge with the Vane brothers, the missing dead, and the gods that were about to arrive. I looked at my guitar. 2 of the silver strings had snapped from the force of the last chord. I only had 4 left. "Stay close to me," I told Sarah, "and don't close your eyes. No matter what you see, don't close your eyes." We began the final climb to the summit. The air was screaming now, a literal wall of sound that felt like it was going to tear the skin right off our bones. The air at the higher elevations of Wolter Ridge didn't just feel thin. It felt wrong. It was like breathing through a wet wool blanket that had been soaked in kerosene. Every lungful of air burned, leaving a bitter, oily coating on the back of my throat. Sarah was leaning heavily on me, her feet dragging through the dark shale. Her breath was coming in short, sharp hitches that sounded like a clock ticking down to 0. "We're almost there," I lied. The truth was, I didn't know where there was any more. The summit should have been a few hundred yards away, but the geometry of the ridge was stretching and warping. The twin cairns looked no closer than they had an hour ago, yet the light pouring from them was so bright it felt like it was peeling the outer layer of my corneas. "I can hear them, Elias," Sarah whispered. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic from before. It was the sound of someone who had already accepted their own death. "They aren't just in the ground. They're in the wind. They're telling me about the 7 trials. My grandfather used to tell me the stories. I thought they were just to keep me from wandering. But they're real. The mountain won't let us pass until it's taken 7 pieces of us." I gripped my guitar neck tighter. "Don't listen to the stories, Sarah. We're getting off this rock." But the first trial hit us before I could finish the sentence. The trial of the whispering fog. A thick, white mist rolled down from the summit with impossible speed. It wasn't cold like normal fog. It was warm and smelled of cinnamon and old books, a smell from my childhood. Suddenly, the screams of the forest were gone. The sounds of the Vane brothers vanished. Instead, I heard my mother's voice. She'd been dead for 15 years, but her voice was as clear as if she were standing right behind me. "Elias, honey, why did you leave me in the dark? So cold in the dirt. Just put the guitar down. Come back to the garden." I felt my knees buckle. The guilt was a physical weight, a leaden hand pressing on my shoulders. I saw her then, standing in the fog, a shimmering, beautiful version of her, reaching out with hands that looked soft and safe. Behind her, I saw the faces of every person I'd failed, every friend I'd lost, every dog I'd buried. They were all smiling, beckoning me to just stop walking, to lay down and sleep. Next to me, Sarah was reaching out into the mist, her eyes glazed. "Grandpa," she breathed. I knew if I touched that fog version of my mother, I'd never wake up. My hand found the D-string, one of the 4 silver wires I had left. I didn't play a chord. I just snapped it with my fingernail. Pluck. The silver note cut through the hallucination like a razor through silk. The beautiful image of my mother curdled, her face elongated, her skin turning into the gray, cracked bark of the high pines. The garden turned into a pit of writhing, black maggots. Sarah screamed as the grandfather she was reaching for dissolved into a cluster of those pale, unblinking eyes. The fog didn't just drift away. It shrieked and retreated, leaving us gasping on the cold stone. One trial down, the trial of the upward fall. As we scrambled further up, the very concept of gravity began to fail. The ground beneath our feet didn't just feel steep. It felt like it was becoming a vertical wall, even though my eyes told me it was a 30-degree slope. My equilibrium shattered. I felt like I was hanging off the edge of a skyscraper by my fingernails. "Elias, we're falling," Sarah shrieked, clutching at a tuft of dead grass that came away in her hand. The world tilted 90 degrees. The valley below us seemed to rush upward, while the summit felt like it was miles below us in a dark abyss. My brain was screaming that I was falling into the sky. I had to jam my fingers into the cracks in the rock, my nails bleeding as I fought the phantom sensation of plummeting. It was a psychic assault. The mountain was trying to trick our inner ears into jumping off the cliff just to make the falling stop. I forced myself to look at the silver strings. They were perfectly straight. They weren't dangling toward the bottom. They were pointing toward the earth. "Look at the silver, Sarah," I yelled over the roar of the simulated wind. "The silver doesn't lie. Follow the strings." We crawled on our bellies, moving like insects across the rock, ignoring the vertigo that made my stomach want to turn inside out. After 20 minutes of agonizing movement, the sensation snapped back to normal. We were panting, covered in grit and blood, but we were higher. The trial of the blood briars. Then came the vegetation. We reached a belt of thick, thorny vines that hadn't been there a moment ago. They were deep crimson, almost black, and they moved with a slow, serpentine intent. They didn't have leaves. They had rows of hollow, needle-like teeth. As we tried to push through, the thorns didn't just scratch us. They latched on. They began to drink. I felt a vine wrap around my calf, and a sudden, cold drain of energy hit me as it began to pump my blood out into its own stalk. The vine turned from black to a bright, healthy ruby red. "They're eating us," Sarah cried. She was being pulled toward the center of the thicket, her arm encased in a web of the thirsty briars. I didn't use a string this time. I used the heavy, silver-plated tuning pegs of the guitar. I slammed the headstock down onto the vines, the metal searing them. They hissed like snakes, a foul-smelling smoke rising from the wounds. I hacked and beat at them, the silver making the vines recoil in a localized seizure. I dragged Sarah out, her sleeve soaked in blood, but we were moving. The trial of the mirror of bone. The fourth trial was silence. A silence so absolute it felt like being buried alive in a tomb of lead. I looked at Sarah to say something, but when I saw her, I froze. Her skin was becoming transparent. I could see her veins, her muscles, and then, with a sickening clarity, her skeleton. But it wasn't a human skeleton. Her ribs were lengthening, curving into serrated blades. Her skull was shifting, the jaw unhinging and growing rows of needle teeth. I looked at my own hands. My skin was sloughing off in wet, gray clumps, revealing the white bone beneath. My fingers were turning into long, spindly talons, the same limbs I'd seen on the creatures in the woods. The mountain wasn't just killing us. It was turning us into its servants. It was accelerating our absorption into the ridge. I'm changing," Sarah wheezed, her voice sounding like a rattle of dry bones. I gripped the guitar. My fingers felt like brittle sticks. I played a low, vibrating note on the A string. The sound didn't travel through the air. It traveled through our bones. The vibration shook the illusion apart. I watched as the translucent skin solidified and the monstrous features receded. But I knew it wasn't a total win. My reflection in the silver hardware of the guitar showed my eyes were beginning to pale. The white was spreading. The trial of the breath of ash. The fifth and sixth trials hit in rapid succession. The air turned to ash. Not wood ash, but the fine, gray dust of cremated remains. It filled our lungs, making every breath a battle against suffocation. Then came the song of the unmaking. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to emanate from the stones themselves. It was a counter-melody to my silver strings, a sound that made my cells want to drift apart. It was the sound of the universe returning to chaos. I was down to 2 strings, the E and the G. I played them together, a dissonant, jarring interval that felt like a slap to the face. The ash cleared for a heartbeat, and the unmaking song faltered. "We're there," Sarah gasped. We had reached the final plateau. The twin cairns stood before us, 2 massive, jagged monoliths of black stone that seemed to drink the light around them. The white pillars of energy were screaming into the sky, and the shapes from the stars were hovering just above the peak, their massive, stone-like bodies casting shadows that felt like ice. But between us and the cairns stood the seventh trial, the trial of the Gate of Teeth. Silas and Caleb Vane were waiting, but they weren't men anymore. They had merged. Their bodies had fused into a single, horrific mass of pale flesh and jagged bone. Silas's scarred face was on the left, Caleb's frantic face on the right, both sharing a torso that was supported by 6 spindly, multi-jointed limbs. In the center of their fused chest was a mouth, a vertical maw filled with the yellowed tooth knives they had been carrying. "The singer has arrived," the two heads said in a distorted, overlapping unison. "The strings are thin, but the blood is thick." The creature lunged, its 6 legs skittering across the rock with terrifying speed. I stood my ground, my fingers hovering over the last 2 silver strings. I could hear the slurping sound coming from the earth beneath the cairns. The old gods were pushing their way up. The mountain was opening like a hungry mouth. I looked at Sarah. She was huddled on the ground, the violet light of the summit reflecting in her fading eyes. I knew this was it. "Get behind me," I said, my voice as cold as the mountain. The Vane thing let out a shriek that cracked the nearby stones, its chest mouth gnashing in anticipation of the feast. Behind it, the black monoliths began to glow with a dark, ancient hunger. The creature that used to be Silas and Caleb Vane didn't move like a man. It moved like a collection of broken umbrellas being shoved along by a frantic wind. Its 6 limbs, long, pale, and covered in a fine layer of gray fuzz, tapped against the black shale of the summit. Tack, 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 tack. The sound was rhythmic, like a telegraph sending a message of pure hate. I stood between the Vane thing and Sarah. My boots were slipping on the loose rock. The wind at the peak was so loud it sounded like a jet engine was idling right over our heads. The white light from the twin cairns was so thick I felt like I was wading through milk. It was hard to see, hard to breathe, and even harder to think. "The song is broken, Elias," the left head Silas croaked. His jaw was still hanging crooked, but the muscle had knitted back together into a thick, ropus scar. "The silver is tired," the right head Caleb added. His eyes were leaking a thick, yellow fluid that smoked when it hit his collar. "Give us the girl. The old ones don't want you. You're just a gnat." A tiny, silver-shining gnat. The vertical mouth in their chest yawned open. It was a cavern of wet, red meat lined with dozens of the yellow tooth blades. A gout of hot, stinking steam billowed out, smelling of ancient rot and digested copper. "You want the music?" I growled, my voice barely audible over the roar of the summit. "Here's the encore." I didn't play a melody. I didn't have enough strings left for a melody. I reached out and grabbed the G-string, pulling it so hard the silver wire bit deep into my thumb. I felt the skin pop. I felt the warm slide of my own blood down the string. My blood was the catalyst. The silver hummed, turning from a dull white to a blinding electric blue. I released it. Bong. The sound wasn't a note. It was a physical strike. A wave of blue energy rippled out from the guitar, slamming into the Vane thing. The creature was lifted off its 6 feet and thrown backward. It hit the base of the left cairn with a sound like a bag of wet laundry hitting a wall. But it didn't die. These things didn't follow the rules of biology anymore. They were fueled by the mountain. The Vane thing scrambled back up, its limbs twisting in ways that made my own joints ache just looking at them. It let out a dual-toned shriek, a high-pitched whistle from Caleb and a low, guttural roar from Silas. It lunged, not walking this time, but jumping. It covered the 20 feet between us in a single, blurring arc. I swung the guitar upward, using the body of the instrument as a shield. The creature's chest mouth slammed into the wood. The tooth blades sank deep into the vintage mahogany, the yellow bone knives snapping and splintering as they hit the internal silver bracing I'd installed years ago. The weight of the thing knocked me flat onto my back. Now I was pinned. The Vane thing was on top of me, its 6 legs locking around my torso like the ribs of a cage. The 2 heads leaned down, one on each side of my face. I could smell their breath. It smelled like a basement that had been flooded with swamp water. "We will eat the silver from your bones," Silas hissed into my left ear. "We will sing with your lungs," Caleb whispered into my right. The chest mouth was inches from my face. I could see down into its gullet. It wasn't just a throat. It was a portal. Deep inside the Vane thing's chest, I could see a miniature version of the twin cairns, glowing with that same sickly green light. It was as if they were carrying a piece of the mountain's heart inside them. Couldn't move my arms. The creature's weight was crushing the air out of my lungs. My vision started to swim. I saw Sarah crawling toward us, her hands clawing at the dirt, but she was too weak to help. She looked like a ghost already. I had one move left. My right hand was trapped near the bridge of the guitar. My fingers were slick with my own blood. I found the very last string, the low E. It was the thickest silver wire I had. I didn't pluck it. I bit it. I leaned forward, my teeth catching the silver wire. I pulled back with my neck, stretching the string to its absolute limit. The metal tasted like electricity and pennies. My gums started to bleed, the copper of my blood meeting the silver of the string. The Vane thing paused, its heads tilted in unison, sensing the shift in energy. I let go. The vibration didn't just come from the guitar, it came from my skull. The silver string snapped against the bridge, and a shockwave of pure, holy frequency exploded. Because I was touching the string with my mouth and the Vane thing was biting the guitar, the energy traveled directly into the creature's fused nervous system. The Vane thing didn't just scream, it disintegrated. The pale flesh began to boil and slew off the bone. The 6 limbs twitched and shattered. The 2 heads pulled apart, the skin between them tearing like wet cardboard. In a spray of black ichor and yellow sparks, the Vane brothers were unmade. The green light in their chest flared one last time, then went dark. I pushed the heavy, stinking remains off me and rolled away, gasping for air. My mouth was a mess of blood and silver dust. The guitar was ruined. The wood splintered, the strings all gone. I was defenseless, but the death of the Vane brothers wasn't the end. It was the dinner bell. The twin cairns began to vibrate so violently that the ground beneath them started to liquefy. The black stone didn't just glow. It began to peel back. The rock was actually a husk. Underneath the stone of the monoliths were 2 massive, lidless eyes. They were the size of houses, staring straight up at the shapes in the sky. "Elias!" Sarah's voice was a whimper. I looked up. The sky was no longer purple. It was a bruised, throbbing red. The bloated, stone-like shapes from the stars had finally arrived. They weren't jellyfish. Up close, they looked like massive, floating brains made of translucent marble. Long, shimmering filaments hung down from them, miles of glowing, sensory threads that were now touching the peaks of the surrounding mountains. The slurping sound from the earth reached a crescendo. It wasn't coming from a hole anymore. It was coming from the very air. The ground beneath us began to rise. Not a landslide, but a lifting. A massive, pale hand, miles wide, was pushing its way out of the crust of the earth. Wolter Ridge wasn't a mountain. It was a knuckle. The entire mountain range was the spine of something that had been buried since the world was cooling. The old gods weren't coming to visit. They were coming home to a body they had left behind. One of the filaments from the sky brains drifted down, moving with a slow, purposeful grace. It looked like a thread of liquid diamond. It touched the top of the right cairn, the giant eye, and the eye blinked. The sound of that blink was like a tectonic plate snapping. A shockwave of cold air knocked me and Sarah flat. "They're waking him up," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the sky. "The ridge, it's not just land. It's a sleeper." The filaments were beginning to weave together. They were creating a web between the sky and the mountain. And in the center of that web, the light was beginning to solidify into a shape. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a god. It was a doorway into a place where the sun never rose and the wind never stopped screaming. I looked at my broken guitar. I looked at my bloody hands. I had come here to save a girl and stop a ritual. I had killed the men who started it. But the mountain didn't care about the Vane brothers. They were just the alarm clock. The mountain was awake now, and it was hungry for more than just blood. It wanted the world back. The first tentacle, thick as an oak tree and covered in wet, gray suction cups, erupted from the center of the dead man's shelf below us. It lashed out, grabbing a cluster of the high pines and crushing them into splinters in seconds. The old gods were no longer whispers. They were the only sound left in the world. I grabbed Sarah's hand. We were standing on the brow of a titan that was standing up. There was nowhere to run. The only way was down, into the throat of the mountain itself. "Hold on," I told her. But I didn't know what I was telling her to hold on to. The world was falling apart, and I had used my last silver string. The world didn't just end with a bang. It ended with a groan. A deep, tectonic vibration that felt like the planet itself was catching its breath for the first time in a billion years. As the Vane brothers' remains dissolved into black sludge, the ground beneath my feet didn't feel like rock anymore. Felt like flesh. Very old, very cold, and very angry flesh. Wolter Ridge was no longer a mountain. It was a limb, a massive, jagged spine of a creature so large that human cities were nothing more than dust on its skin. The twin cairns, those massive black eyes, were fully open now. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at the sky, at the things descending from the stars. I grabbed Sarah by the waist and hauled her back from the edge of the summit. The rock was liquefying into a thick, gray slurry. In the center of the plateau, right between those two house-sized eyes, a new structure was rising. It was a slab of obsidian, polished to a mirror finish, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the thumping I'd heard in the earth. This was it, the altar on the summit. "Elias, the trees!" Sarah screamed, pointing down the slope. I looked back. The high pines, the missing woods, were no longer stationary. They were being pulled upward by the movement of the titan. But they weren't just trees anymore. The thousands of people who had been absorbed over the centuries were being squeezed out of the bark like juice from a fruit. I saw pale, bark-covered limbs and needle-filled faces being fused together into a living wall of meat and wood. They were being gathered. They were the sacrifice that would grease the gears of the world's end. The sky brains, the star gods, were directly overhead now. Their translucent bodies were filled with pulsing electric veins. The filaments they dropped were like fishing lines, and we were the bait. One of the threads, glowing with a violet intensity, began to coil around the obsidian altar. The air around us began to hum. It wasn't a sound you hear with your ears. It was a sound you feel in your marrow. It was the language of the first gods. It sounded like the grinding of glaciers and the birth of a sun. The vessel is empty. The wind seemed to howl. The vessel must be filled. The filaments weren't looking for the Vane brothers. They were looking for a host, a human mind to act as a bridge between the cosmic hunger in the sky and the terrestrial hunger of the mountain. I looked at Sarah. She was staring at the altar, her eyes wide and blank. She was walking toward it, not because she wanted to, but because she was being pulled. The threads were invisible now, but I could see the way her skin was stretching toward the obsidian slab. "Sarah, stop!" I lunged for her, but the air between us suddenly turned into a wall of solid pressure. I was slammed back against the base of the left cairn, the giant eye. The eye moved. A massive, milky pupil, 30 feet across, swiveled in its socket and looked directly at me. The sheer scale of the intelligence behind that gaze was enough to make my heart stop. It wasn't evil. Evil is a human concept. This was just vast. It was the gaze of a hurricane looking at a single blade of grass. I felt my mind begin to fray. Images flooded my brain. Civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye, the earth being swallowed by ice, the stars turning black. The mountain god was sharing its memories, and they were heavy enough to crush a human soul. "Get out of my head!" I screamed, slamming my fists against the wet, leathery surface of the eye. I reached for my guitar, but it was a pile of splinters. No strings, no music, nothing to conduct the silver. Wait, the silver. I looked at my hands. They were covered in the silver dust from the snapped strings, mixed with my own blood and the black ichor of the Vane brothers. The silver wasn't just in the strings anymore. It was in me. I had inhaled the dust. I had bitten the wire. I realized then what the songs were for. My ancestors, the wanderers and singers of the hills, they hadn't been playing music to entertain. They were tuning themselves. They were turning their very bodies into a frequency that the old gods couldn't stomach. I stood up, my legs shaking. Sarah was now draped across the obsidian altar. The sky filaments were descending, hovering inches above her chest. If they touched her, she would become the voice of the mountain. She would be the one to scream the command that would cause the Titan to stand up fully and shake the world off its back. "Hey!" I yelled at the sky. "You want a bridge? Try me." The filaments paused. The violet light shifted, focusing on me. The mountain eye swiveled back, its pupil contracting. The pressure wall vanished. I ran toward the altar, my boots splashing through the gray slurry of the summit. As I reached Sarah, I didn't try to pull her off. I knew the mountain wouldn't let her go. Instead, I grabbed the silver-plated headstock of my broken guitar, the only piece of the instrument that was still intact. The silver tuning pegs were still there, gleaming in the sickly light. I slammed the silver metal down onto the obsidian altar right next to Sarah's head. The reaction was instantaneous. The obsidian wasn't just stone. It was a conductor. The moment the silver touched the altar, a circuit was completed. The energy from the mountain, the cold, ancient power of the sleeper, met the energy from the sky, the hot, electric hunger of the star gods. And I was the fuse. White-hot agony ripped through my arms. I felt my veins turn into lines of fire. My vision went white, then red, then a color I didn't have a name for. I wasn't Elias Thorne anymore. I was a wire. I was a scream made of silver and blood. The mountain roared. Not a metaphorical roar, but a physical sound that shattered the trees for 10 miles in every direction. The Titan beneath us was being shocked. It was like a defibrillator to the heart of a god. Sarah was thrown from the altar by the force of the discharge. She tumbled across the shale, landing near the edge of the plateau. Couldn't let go. My hands were fused to the silver headstock, and the headstock was fused to the altar. I was being consumed. I could feel the star gods trying to crawl down my throat, and the mountain trying to pull my soul into the dirt. "Snap it!" A voice screamed in my head. It wasn't the gods. It was the old man from the trail. Or maybe it was just my own survival instinct. I used the last of my strength to twist the headstock. I didn't try to pull it away. I tried to break the silver. The tuning pegs snapped. The circuit broke. The explosion was silent. A dome of white light expanded from the altar, pushing back the sky filaments and dimming the giant eyes of the mountain. For a single heartbeat, the weight of the ridge vanished. I felt like I was floating in a void of pure, cold silver. Then gravity came back with a vengeance. The summit collapsed. The obsidian altar shattered into a million shards. The twin cairns, the eyes, rolled back and sank into the liquefying earth. The mountain titan let out one final, world-shaking groan and began to settle. It wasn't waking up anymore. It was being forced back into a coma. I felt the air rushing past me. I saw the high pines rushing up to meet me, the living wall of meat and wood. I saw Sarah's face, pale and terrified, as she too was swept away by the landslide of the ridges settling. The copper smell was gone. It was replaced by the smell of ozone and burnt hair. As I hit the ground, everything went dark. But in that darkness, I heard a new sound. It wasn't a roar or a hiss or a slurping wet tongue. It was a single, clear note from a guitar. A silver note. And then, the silence of the Appalachians returned. But this time it wasn't a wait. It was just empty. Pain is a teacher. It tells you exactly where the edges of your soul are. When I finally opened my eyes, the world was gray. Not the soft gray of a morning mist, but the flat, dead gray of a furnace after the fire has gone out. My head was resting on a pile of sharp shale. My left arm was a numb, heavy weight that didn't feel like it belonged to my body anymore. My right hand was still clutching the shattered headstock of the guitar. The silver tuning pegs were melted, fused into a single lump of blackened metal. I tried to sit up, and the mountain screamed. Or maybe it was just me. I was lying halfway down the slope of Wolter Ridge. The landslide caused by the settling of the Titan had carried me nearly a mile from the summit. Looking up, I couldn't see the twin cairns anymore. The peak of the mountain had collapsed in on itself, leaving a jagged, hollowed-out crater that looked like a broken tooth. The white light was gone. The red sky had faded into a sickly, bruised dawn. "Sarah?" I croaked. My throat felt like I'd swallowed a handful of dry needles. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind. But the wind had changed. It didn't hiss or whisper anymore. It just moved across the rocks with a hollow, empty sound. The presence, that massive, ancient weight of the old gods, felt distant. Not gone, but shoved back. Tucked away under the crust of the earth like a bad dream you forget the moment you wake up. I forced myself to my feet. Every joint in my body popped and groaned. I looked at my hands. The silver dust hadn't washed away. It had been driven into my pores by the electrical discharge. My skin had a faint, metallic sheen to it, like the belly of a fish. I could feel a hum in my blood, a low-frequency vibration that matched the pulse of the mountain. I started to walk, or rather, I started to limp. I found Sarah about 50 yards down the slope. She was tangled in the branches of a fallen hemlock. These weren't the merged trees of the high pines anymore. The living wall of meat and wood had been shredded by the landslide. What was left were just broken trunks and piles of gray, lifeless matter that looked more like wet cardboard than human flesh. The mountain had reclaimed its sacrifice, but it had chewed it up first. I pulled the branches away. Sarah was breathing, but her eyes were open and fixed on the gray sky. "Sarah, it's Elias. We have to go." She didn't look at me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I reached down to touch her shoulder, and as soon as my silver-stained skin made contact, she flinched. She let out a soft, jagged whimper. "The eyes," she whispered. "They're still open, Elias. They're just looking at the other side now." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. I hauled her up and slung her arm over my shoulder. We began the long, agonizing descent back toward the valley. The high pines were a graveyard of splinters. The trail was gone, buried under tons of rock and the remains of the Vane brothers' hut. As we walked through the ruins of the forest, I saw things that I'll never be able to unsee. I saw the man who had been merged with the tree. He was lying in the dirt now, his bark skin peeling away to reveal nothing but dry, white bone inside. There was no blood. The mountain had taken everything. We reached the Barton cabin by mid-afternoon. It was a heap of rotted lumber. The hole in the floor, the one that had led down into the throat of the ridge, was filled with solid, black stone. It looked like the mountain had cauterized its own wound. I didn't stop. I kept walking until we reached the gravel road where I'd left my truck. The truck was still there, sitting under a layer of fine, gray ash. It looked like a relic from another century. I put Sarah in the passenger seat. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together. I got into the driver's seat and looked in the rearview mirror. My eyes were no longer brown. They were the color of tarnished silver. I started the engine. The sound felt violently loud in the dead silence of the ridge. I turned the truck around and drove down the mountain, away from Wolter Ridge, away from the high pines, and away from the things that sleep in the dark. But as I reached the main highway, I realized something. The hum in my blood wasn't going away. Every time I passed a stand of trees, I felt a tug. Every time the sun went behind a cloud, I felt a shadow move in the corner of my eye. I looked at the radio. I reached out and turned the dial, but there was nothing but static. No, it wasn't static. If I listened closely, I could hear it. The slurping sound, the rhythmic thumping. The old gods hadn't been defeated. They had just been put back to bed. And I had the key to the bedroom under my skin. I drove for hours. I took Sarah to a hospital 2 counties over. I told them we'd been caught in a landslide. I told them she was in shock. They took her away on a gurney, and she never once looked back at me. She knew. She knew that even though we were off the mountain was never going to be off us. I went to a motel. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. The silver was spreading. It was moving up my arms, turning my veins into glowing, metallic threads. I realized then why the Vane brothers were so desperate to wake the gods. It wasn't about power. It was about the hunger. Once you touch that ancient cold, nothing else ever feels warm again. The sun feels like a pale imitation of a real fire. Food tastes like ash. Music just sounds like noise. I reached for my guitar case, forgetting for a second that it was empty. I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the distant silhouette of the Appalachian Range. They looked so peaceful, so solid, like giant, sleeping dogs. But I knew better. I knew that under that dirt and those trees, the blood was moving. The grandfathers were waiting. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't my heart. It was coming from the floor, from the foundation, from the very earth beneath the motel. The silver in my veins began to hum. I closed my eyes and, for the first time since I stepped onto Wolter Ridge, I started to sing. It wasn't a song of protection. It wasn't a song of silver. It was a song of welcome, because the old gods don't stay awake forever, but they never truly die. They just wait for someone with enough silver in their blood to call them back. And I could feel my throat starting to itch. I could feel the needles starting to grow. I turned off the light. The darkness in the room didn't feel empty. Felt full. Felt like a wet tongue licking a wound. The ridge was calling. And soon, very soon, the whole world would hear the music. I really hope that story kept you on the edge of your seat. Wolter Ridge is a place best left unvisited. Don't you think? If you enjoyed this journey into the dark heart of the mountains, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It's the best way to support the stories and ensure we can keep exploring these urban legends and folk horrors together. Until next time, keep your silver close and stay out of the high pines. Good night, everyone.